This is Aaron Hobson with Rhinebeck School of Music, and in this lesson we're going to talk about substituting a 5 dominant chord with a diminished chord and several ways that you can do that. If you guys are green on your diminished theory, you can go back to my first video, which is Diminished Chords Part 1, and I talk about the theory of how to build a diminished chord, how to make a triad, what a diminished seventh is, and I talk about a couple of chord voicings that I like to use for the diminished 7. So I recommend, if you don't know much about diminished chords, to go to that video first. That way we can talk about actually starting to apply these chords to music. So the diminished chord is a very unique sound, and it's a great way to create tension and then resolve it. So a common way to use a diminished chord is to replace a functioning dominant chord, which is your 5 chord, with a diminished chord. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. And these are called chord substitutions. We're substituting the 5 chord for a diminished chord. So let's take a really common chord progression that's like common in blues, it's rock, pop, it's common in jazz. So we're going to talk about the 1, the 6, the 2, and the 5 chord progression. So of course we always relate things to C first because C is the easiest key to talk about. There's no sharps, no flats. So if I was just going to play that chord straight out, I have my basic campfire C, my basic campfire A minor, my D minor, and my G7. Now if I want to spice that up a little bit, I can turn this minor chord into a dominant 7 chord, into an A7. So going back to my video on secondary dominance, that would be considered a 5 of 2 chord. I'm subbing out the minor, I'm borrowing a chord from another key to make that a dominant 7. Now it has a little bit more of a pull to that D minor. So listen, here's C, A minor, D minor, G7. Now I'm going to do the A7 instead. C, A7, D minor, G7. So it's a little bit spicier, right? Because I've added that C sharp. It wants to pull to that D minor a little more than the C natural does. So that's the chord progression we're going to work with. It's a common turnaround in a lot of music. And you can just play with those 2 progressions and just kind of mess around and see if you can hear the difference between the A minor and the A dominant 7. So now let's talk about how we can sub out that A7 with a diminished chord. So possibility number 1. So let's take a look at the notes of an A7. So the notes in an A7 chord are going to be A, C sharp, E, and G natural. So possibility number 1 is we are going to take the major third of the dominant 7 chord and build a diminished chord off of it. So the major third of an A7 chord is C sharp. So we're going to build a diminished chord off of that C sharp root, right? So I'm going to have all this in PDFs attached to this video on Patreon. So here's my C sharp diminished. This is one of the chords I talked about in the previous video. That's a good voicing. I have C sharp, G, A sharp, and E. So if you think of the notes of A7, which are A, C sharp, E, and G, and the notes of C sharp diminished, which are C sharp, E, G, and A sharp, there's only one note difference, right? That A sharp as opposed to the A. So they're very similar. So now let's hear what this sounds like in context. I'm just going to take my C chord. I'm going to go to C sharp diminished, then to D minor, G7, back to C. And of course, I could sub out this G because it's a 5 going to the 1 C. I could sub that out with a diminished 2 by going to a B diminished. So now we've got C, C sharp diminished, D minor, B diminished, back to the C chord. So let's take a look at that in some other keys. So let's say I want to do it in the key of F. Then I would have F is my 1 chord. I'd go a half step to F sharp diminished, resolve to that G minor, then to the C. So I have F, F sharp diminished, G minor, C7, back to F. So again, this voicing of the diminished chord, I'll have have all these attached as PDFs so that you can kind of practice these, but these were chords that I talked about in my previous diminished video, so if you're not familiar, you can go back to that. So now let's try it in the key of D. So in D we'd have D, the 6 would be the B7, turning into the B7, E minor to A7. But instead of that B7, we're going to play a D sharp, because that's the major third of B. So we're going to play D. And actually, I'm going to play the D sharp diminished here because it's a little bit easier to grab off of this root, to E minor to A7. So I'll have that also in a PDF attached with those chord voicings. So those are the 3 common diminished voicings that I talked about earlier. The root on the A string, like this, the root on the tom string, and the root on the D string, like that. So those are 3 voicings if you want to work with diminished that you really want to get under your belt. And one thing you can remember is that, remember with every diminished chord, you move it up 3 frets, and you have just a different inversion of your, it's the same notes in a different order, a different inversion of the chord. So if you have C sharp diminished, is also E diminished, is also G diminished, is also A sharp diminished. So you have a lot of possibilities there for using roots. And I talked about that in my previous video as well. Okay, so possibility number 2 kind of leads you to the same result as this first example I talked about. It's just another way of thinking about it and approaching it. So what you can also do is take that 5 chord and go a half step higher than your root. So if my root is A on A7, I go to an A sharp and I build a diminished off of that A sharp root. So now I have this, I have the C chord to the A sharp to the D minor to the G7. So C, A sharp diminished, D minor to G7, back to C. So that A sharp diminished 7 was an inversion of C sharp, right? Because we had C sharp, E, G, and then A sharp. So it's kind of the same idea, because even if you're using like these inversions of A sharp, your next inversion would be with the C sharp in the bass, right? So it kind of leads you to the same place. It's just another way of thinking about it, right? And using a different root note. So again, we can talk about different keys. So if we're in the key of F, you have F to D sharp diminished to G minor to C7. So the 1 chord is F, subbing out that D7 with a D sharp, going up a half step from my root, G minor to C7, back to F. Now I'll try an example in D. So we have D, a half step higher than the B7 would be a C diminished, and then E minor to A7, back to D. So 2 examples that kind of bring you to the same inversions of the diminished chord. It's just you're treating the root differently, right? So example 1, you're going from that A7, taking the major third, building the diminished off the major third, and in the next example, you're building the diminished 7 off of like the half step higher than the root of your dominant 7. And that gives it more of a flat 9 sound too. It's like you're putting the flat 9. It's almost like you're just playing an A7 flat 9 with that flat 9 in the bass. It's the most common way that I personally use it in jazz in particular. And then the last example I'm going to use is called a tritone chord substitution. So what is a tritone? A tritone is an augmented 4 or diminished 5th, right? So if we're talking about an A7, the 5th is E, but if I flat that 5, I get E flat, right? So now E flat is going to be the root of my diminished chord. So I'm going to play C, then I'm going to play an E flat diminished, and then I'm going to play the D minor to the G7. So really this is thinking about it as a half step higher than your target 1 chord. So if my target is D minor, then I want to think a half step higher than that. So the first approach, we thought a half step lower than D minor, which was C sharp. Now we're thinking a half step higher to E flat. So if we try that in the key of F, we'd have your F to an A flat diminished to a G minor to a C7 back to F. And if we did that in the key of D, we'd have D to this F diminished to an E minor to an A7. So we'd have this D to an F diminished E minor to A7 and back to D. So again, I have all those PDFs available on Patreon. You can download them as an attachment. And hopefully that'll spice up some of your chord progressions. I have so much more to talk about with diminished, and I'll be doing some more videos on that later. So if you haven't already, visit www.rhinebeckschoolofmusic.com and subscribe to us on YouTube. Become a patron at patreon.com/rhinebeckschoolofmusic. I'll see you at the next one.